Tonight, we uncover a rivalry buried beneath stone walls and holy crowns. A war not fought in open fields, but in whispers, trials, and fire. The Knights Templar, warriors sworn to God, and the Vatican, the seat of ultimate power, bound together at first, then torn apart by fear, secrets, and control. For centuries, the story has been softened into legend, the truth hidden in archives and erased from sermons. But what if their downfall was no accident? What if it was the most calculated betrayal in history? These were not just monks in armour. They held wealth, influence, and perhaps knowledge that could unmake Rome itself. The Vatican could not risk rivals with swords, ships, and secrets. So one night, the blessing turned into chains, and loyalty became ash. Yet, even as fires burned, the Templar shadow did not vanish. It slipped into new names, new lands, new symbols, waiting. This isn't just history. It's the silent war that shaped faith, kingdoms, and the world we live in now. So before you dismiss this as a legend carved into old stone, ask yourself, what if the Vatican's greatest enemy was once its most loyal servant? Like the video, subscribe, because tonight we uncover the secret war between the Templars and the Vatican. The year is the end of the 11th century, and the world of Christendom is about to change forever. Across Europe, rumours swirl of a call from Rome, a plea for warriors to march east and reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim rule. Kings sharpen swords, peasants dream of relics and riches, and the Pope himself promises salvation to any who take the cross. From these fiery sermons rises not just a war, but something more dangerous, a collision of authority that will echo for centuries. This is where the story begins, in the dust of the Crusades, where two powers grow side by side, each claiming the right to shape the soul of the world. At first, it looks like unity. The Vatican, already wielding spiritual supremacy, finds itself at the centre of a new holy cause. It blesses armies, crowns, generals, and claims every victory as proof of divine favour. The Church insists that its authority flows directly from God, channeled through popes, bishops, and priests. But while Rome speaks with sacred words, another force moves quietly across the battlefield, one born not of pulpits, but of discipline, steel, and secrecy. They call themselves the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ, later known as the Knights Templar. At first, they are only a small band of warriors sworn to protect pilgrims travelling the dangerous roads to Jerusalem. But their vows are radical: poverty, chastity, obedience, and a strange fourth promise, to guard not only lives, but holy mysteries. They kneel before the Temple Mount and take their oaths where Solomon's temple once stood, a site heavy with legend. Few notice them at first, but in their silence and austerity, they become something more than soldiers. They are monks who fight, priests who bleed, a paradox wrapped in armour. As battles rage across the Levant, both the Vatican and the Templars grow in power, but their strength comes from different sources. Rome commands through faith and fear of damnation. The Templars command through loyalty forged in blood, and the whispers that they have found something beneath the ruins of the temple, something the Church cannot fully control. Pilgrims speak of safe passage guaranteed by their swords. Merchants trust them with gold and letters of credit. Kings look at them with envy and suspicion. It is in this crucible that a secret rivalry is born. The Vatican cannot afford competition for authority, especially one that wears the cross yet answers to no pope. The Templars claim to serve Christ directly, bypassing the layers of bishops and curia. Their independence is subtle but dangerous. Every victory they win on the battlefield is a reminder that holiness can be carried not only by priests, but by warriors who kneel in stone halls far from Rome. Imagine standing in a cathedral in the year 1200, incense heavy in the air, the bishop's words echoing from the pulpit. Now imagine the same cross carried into battle by knights whose prayers are whispered before charging into death. Both claim the same God, both command loyalty, but only one can truly rule. This is the dawn of two powers, a sacred partnership built on mistrust, a union destined to fracture, and a secret war already waiting beneath the surface. It begins in the year 1119, when 9 knights gather in Jerusalem. The city has been torn by war, its streets echoing with prayers and blood, its holy sites contested by armies and merchants alike. Pilgrims pour in from across Europe, hoping to touch the stones where Christ once walked, but the roads are haunted by bandits and raiders. Into this danger step men who decide to live by a vow unlike anything Europe has seen. They call themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ, and they take their oaths not in a cathedral, but upon the ground of the Temple Mount itself. They promise to renounce wealth, to live in chastity, to obey their masters, and to protect the weak with their swords. In this moment, a paradox is born: monks who fight, soldiers who pray, and guardians who kneel where Solomon's temple once rose. The image is striking. Armour-clad men kneeling in silence on the ruins of a sacred foundation, swearing themselves to God rather than to king or pope. Their leader, Hugues de Payens, shapes their identity not as mercenaries but as warriors dedicated to a holy mission. Their presence is small at first, only 9 knights against the dangers of the East, yet their oath gives them power far greater than their numbers. The Temple Mount becomes their home, a place layered with mystery. Once the dwelling of the Ark of the Covenant according to legend, whispers begin almost immediately. Some say the knights dig beneath the ancient stones. Some claim they find relics, perhaps manuscripts, hidden since the days of the apostles. Whatever the truth, their secrecy adds to their aura. Back in Europe, their reputation spreads quickly. By the year 1129, the Council of Troyes officially recognizes the order. The Vatican grants them approval, a papal blessing that allows them to move freely between kingdoms. It seems like an alliance, the Church sanctifying the new warrior monks, but woven into the blessing is a seed of tension. Because the Templars answer directly to the Pope, bypassing bishops and local lords, they are accountable to no one else. They are free from taxes, free from oversight, and free to build their own network of command. Rome intended this as a mark of trust, but it also means the Church has created a rival institution with its own chain of loyalty. As the years pass, the oath sworn in Jerusalem begins to echo across Europe. Noble families send sons to join. Donations of land and treasure pour in. What began with 9 knights swearing in the ruins of a temple grows into a movement that commands castles, fleets, and treasuries. And yet their foundation is always the vow, the memory of stone and silence on the Temple Mount. Their identity is forged in secrecy and devotion, and in that secrecy lies the shadow of rivalry. For while Rome sees them as servants of the Church, the knights themselves see their allegiance as something higher, sworn not to popes or crowns, but to Christ alone. It is this difference, quiet at first, that will one day ignite a conflict between the Vatican and the Templars, a secret war born from oaths carved in stone. Jerusalem, in the 12th century, was more than a city. It was a layered memory of faith and conquest, where every stone carried stories older than the Crusaders who now ruled it. At the very heart of this sacred geography stood the Temple Mount, the place where Solomon's temple was said to have once housed the Ark of the Covenant, where prophets spoke with God, and where blood and fire had marked the fate of nations. It was here that the newly formed Knights Templar established their headquarters, choosing not a palace or fortress, but the ruins of the most mysterious site in biblical history. From the very beginning, whispers began to spread that their purpose was more than protecting pilgrims. For nearly a decade, the knights seemed strangely occupied. While others fought wars or guarded roads, the Templars kept to their quarters, working in silence and secrecy. Some chronicles mention long hours underground, stones being moved, passages being cleared. Locals whispered of tunnels stretching deep below the mount. Rumours grew that they had found chambers sealed since the destruction of the temple centuries earlier. What they were looking for remains a mystery, but the possibilities have haunted imaginations ever since. Was it relics of the ancient Hebrews, fragments of Solomon's wisdom, or something far more threatening to Rome, a gospel or record that challenged the Church's authority? The silence of the Knights only fueled speculation. They offered no explanations, issued no denials, and allowed stories to grow unchecked. Pilgrims claimed they saw carts of rubble being carried away at night. Others spoke of relics being shipped quietly back to Europe. Legends insist they uncovered the Ark itself, or manuscripts written in the time of Christ that told a story the Vatican would never allow. The lack of proof is part of the power. An empty corridor or a sealed vault leaves more questions than answers, and in those questions grows fear. By the year 1129, when the order was officially recognized, the digging seemed to stop, or at least to move out of sight. What they found, if anything, was hidden away. Yet the transformation of the order from a small band of knights into a wealthy and powerful institution came suddenly after these years of silence. Some historians see a connection. Donations and privileges multiplied as though the knights had secured not only treasures but leverage. Rome gave them exemptions, kings gave them land, and merchants trusted them with gold. It is hard not to wonder if the Templars held a secret that made everyone careful. Imagine standing in those halls, the air damp with the dust of centuries, torches flickering against ancient stones, the sound of shovels and whispered prayers echoing through forgotten tunnels. If they found relics, those relics could shift the center of spiritual gravity away from Rome and toward the men who unearthed them. And if they found writings that contradicted the Church's story of Christ, the entire foundation of papal power would tremble. Whether fact or legend, the dig beneath the temple remains one of the most haunting questions in history, because whatever was uncovered was never spoken of, and in that silence lies the spark of a war that would one day set the Vatican against its own knights. By the middle of the 12th century, the Knights Templar had become more than warriors. They had built something that no king, no noble family, not even the Church itself could fully rival. They created a network, a system of trust and secrecy that spanned continents. Pilgrims travelling to the Holy Land could deposit their wealth in a Templar commandery in Paris or London and receive a letter of credit. That single piece of parchment allowed them to withdraw funds safely once they reached Jerusalem. It was simple in appearance, but revolutionary in practice. For the first time in medieval Europe, money could move without being carried, gold could be protected without needing to be seen, and trust could cross mountains and seas, backed not by crowns, but by the seal of the temple. Kings noticed, merchants noticed, even the Vatican noticed. The knights were no longer just guardians of roads, but guardians of wealth. They built treasuries that rivaled royal vaults. They became lenders to nobles and sovereigns who needed coin for wars and castles. France itself leaned on Templar gold to sustain its throne. In doing so, the order became untouchable. Few dared to offend men who could protect your soul on pilgrimage and your purse at home. Their white mantles with the red cross became a sign not only of piety but of security. The brilliance of the system was its simplicity. A pilgrim might sell land to fund his journey. He handed the proceeds to the local Templar house, received a coded note, and walked without fear of robbery. In Jerusalem, the brothers compared the symbols, verified the mark, and handed him the funds in local coin. It was trust woven into parchment. Yet, behind the trust lurked something unsettling. The Church had always claimed authority over salvation, over sin and forgiveness. But here was a rival system, where salvation of property was managed by knights who bowed only to their own order. This was more than convenience. It was a shift in power. Whispers spread that the Templars carried not just gold, but secrets in their letters. Codes, maps, even fragments of what they had unearthed in Jerusalem might have travelled the same safe channels. Every sealed document was immune from inspection, guarded by papal privilege. Rome realised too late that in giving the knights freedom from oversight, it had allowed them to build an empire of parchment and trust, an empire invisible yet stronger than steel. Picture a merchant standing at a wooden table as a Templar scribe scratches symbols into a letter. The man leaves with no coin in hand, only ink and seal, yet he walks away more secure than any armoured caravan. The power of gold has been replaced by the power of trust, and trust belongs to the order alone. This was the first true bank of Europe, born from vows of poverty, yet controlling riches beyond imagination. And for the Vatican, this was the beginning of unease, because the Knights had created a form of power the Church could bless but never fully command. In the 12th and 13th centuries, power in Europe was a fragile game of crowns and mitres. Kings needed coin to fund wars and castles. Popes needed warriors to expand Christendom and enforce their decrees. And standing between them were the Knights Templar, draped in white with red crosses, holding not just swords, but the invisible keys to thrones. To command their support was to gain a shield that stretched across Europe and into the Holy Land. To anger them was to risk isolation from a network stronger than any single kingdom. When a pope called for a crusade, the Templars became the backbone of the army. Their discipline, their resources, and their reputation meant that kings relied on them to hold lines that mercenaries could not. A monarch who lacked their support faced dwindling odds of victory. Even the mighty Richard the Lionheart leaned on their counsel during the Third Crusade, treating them not as servants but as partners. Their knowledge of routes, supplies, and fortifications gave them leverage. They could turn a campaign into triumph or disaster simply by choosing where to stand. In courts across Europe, their role expanded beyond battlefields. Kings borrowed from their treasuries, and in doing so placed their crowns in invisible chains. Repayment was not always in coin. Sometimes it was in land, sometimes in favours, sometimes in promises whispered in candlelit chapels. Popes who sought to direct the order found themselves walking carefully, for though the Templars had sworn loyalty to Rome, their wealth and autonomy made them difficult to command. Their vow of obedience was to their Grand Master, not to every passing pontiff. This balance of power created tension. Imagine a pope issuing a decree, certain it would be carried out, only to find the knights quietly adjusting its meaning to serve their own ends. Imagine a king begging for a loan to raise troops, knowing that refusal meant not just financial ruin but political humiliation. The order had become a gatekeeper. They could protect a throne, stabilize a dynasty, or let it crumble. In this way, the knights gained a voice in politics without ever placing a crown on their own heads. The presence of Templar fortresses across Europe and the Holy Land only added to their aura. Each commandery was more than a garrison. It was a treasury, a bank, and a hub of information. Letters and rumours flowed through their halls. Secrets passed from east to west under their seal. A king who trusted them too little risked being left out of the flow of knowledge. A pope who trusted them too much risked seeing Rome's authority diluted. Picture a throne room in Paris. A monarch sits uneasy as Templar envoys stand before him. They speak softly, almost humbly, yet their presence is heavy. They are not nobles, not clerics, yet they hold the power to sway battles, to fund wars, to secure pilgrim roads, to legitimize crusades. In that moment, it is clear. The crown may glitter, the papal tiara may shine, but the true keys to power lie in the hands of the knights who never sought to be kings, yet learned how to rule from behind the veil. In the candlelit corridors of monasteries and the stone halls of Templar commanderies, rumours began to stir that the knights carried with them more than swords and gold. They carried texts, whispers of gospels never approved by Rome, writings that spoke in a different tone about Christ, Mary, and the meaning of faith itself. At first, these whispers were easy to dismiss. After all, the Templars were warriors, not scholars, but their long years stationed in Jerusalem, their digging beneath the Temple Mount, and their constant contact with Eastern Christians and even Islamic scholars meant they had access to knowledge hidden from most of Europe. This was where the Vatican grew uneasy. The Church in Rome had built its power not only on relics and rituals, but on the monopoly of interpretation. The Bible had to be read as Rome said it should be. Salvation came through the sacraments Rome controlled. But if the Templars had access to other texts, if they held gospels that told a different story, then their loyalty was no longer just a matter of obedience. It became a question of which truth they believed. Imagine a knight kneeling in prayer, not to the image of Peter's keys, but to a vision of Christ that bypassed the authority of Rome. Imagine entire chapters of the order holding secret rites in vaulted halls where no bishop dared to intrude. Some chroniclers hinted that the knights revered John the Baptist more than Christ, that they honoured the Magdalene as more than just a sinner redeemed, that they guarded teachings that place divine authority not in Rome, but in bloodlines and ancient mysteries. These claims may have been exaggerations, or even fabrications, but they struck a nerve. Because if even a fraction was true, then the order was no longer simply Rome's sword arm. It was a rival source of revelation. The doctrine problem was not open rebellion. The Templars still marched under the cross, still took papal blessings before campaigns, still professed loyalty. But the unease grew in shadows. Bishops noticed that knights avoided confession outside their own circles. Pilgrims whispered of strange symbols carved into Templar chapels, symbols that felt older than Christianity itself. Scholars in Paris wrote quietly of heresy cloaked in armour. Rome began to realise that the Templars' independence was not only financial and military, but spiritual. By the late 12th century, the tension had become impossible to ignore. The papacy relied on the order's strength, yet feared what they might believe behind closed doors. Heresy was the deadliest word in medieval Europe, and once that suspicion took root, it never let go. The knights had opened a dangerous door by carrying back the wisdom of the East, by reading texts not approved, by practicing rites that looked unfamiliar. To some, it made them enlightened. To Rome, it made them dangerous. And in the quiet clash between papal doctrine and Templar secrets, the seeds of their downfall were already sown. In Rome, where ink and parchment shaped destinies as much as swords and shields, the Templars began to face a different kind of battle. It was not fought in dusty deserts or on bloodied fields, but in quiet chambers lined with scrolls. Here, curial lawyers sharpened their pens to draft limits on what the order could and could not do. The Vatican had blessed them as protectors of pilgrims and guardians of the faith, but now that blessing was being re-examined, the knights had grown too wealthy, too independent, too mysterious. Control had to be reasserted, not with armies, but with words that bound tighter than chains. Papal decrees started to carve away at their freedom. Clauses restricted their ability to negotiate directly with monarchs without Rome's oversight. Rules demanded tighter accountability for their treasuries. Even their right to build chapels free from episcopal interference was called into question. Each law seemed minor in isolation, yet together they worked like ropes tightening around a restless beast. The Vatican understood that the order's real danger was not open defiance, but quiet autonomy, and the best way to cut it down was by drowning it in regulations. At the same time, another effort was underway, less visible, but equally deliberate. Archivists began to sift through the legends of Templar miracles, stories told by pilgrims and chroniclers that painted the knights as chosen instruments of God. There were tales of battles won against impossible odds, of visions seen by commanders, of relics discovered beneath the old stones of Jerusalem. These stories had once served the Church as propaganda, rallying support for crusades and reinforcing the aura of divine favour. But as tensions with the order deepened, those same stories became dangerous. If the Templars were seen as miracle bearers, they could rival the saints Rome had carefully curated. So scribes quietly began to edit, to omit, to shift credit away from the knights and back toward papal blessing. In chronicles produced under Vatican influence, references to Templar visions faded. Relics, once tied to their discoveries, were reassigned to bishops or to nameless crusaders. Saints who had connections to the order found their cults diminished or their miracles reassigned. This was not destruction, it was erasure by omission, the slow burial of memory beneath new layers of narrative. Rome understood that power was not only in what was declared, but in what was forgotten. Imagine a pilgrim in the late 12th century entering a cathedral and asking about a miracle he had heard credited to the Templars. The priest would shake his head and point instead to the reliquary of a saint approved by Rome. Over time, the story would shift, the memory would dim, and the knightly miracle would vanish into rumour. By controlling the archives, the Church controlled the future, ensuring that the order's extraordinary aura dimmed while the papacy's light grew brighter. In this way, the shadows in the archives became weapons, quiet but deadly, striking not at the Templars' bodies, but at their legacy, softening them for the blows that were yet to come. The fields of southern France burned in the early 13th century as the Albigensian Crusade swept across Languedoc. Officially, it was a holy war against heresy, a campaign to stamp out the Cathars who taught that the world was divided between a good god of spirit and an evil god of matter. In truth, it was about far more. It was about land, wealth, and who held the right to define faith at the edge of Christendom. Into this storm stepped both the Vatican and the Templars, and for the first time their uneasy alliance began to show cracks. The Cathars had no churches or priests. Their perfecti, men and women alike, lived in poverty, preaching a message that mocked the luxury of bishops and the greed of lords. Rome branded them a threat not just to souls, but to its authority. In 1209, Pope Innocent III declared crusade against them, promising the same indulgences to knights who marched south as those who sailed east. Armies of northern barons descended, swords ready not only to defend orthodoxy, but to seize the fertile lands of Occitania. Fire consumed towns like Béziers, where thousands were slaughtered under the infamous command, "Kill them all, God will know his own." The Templars found themselves trapped in a dilemma. They were sworn to defend the church, yet many of their commanderies lay within Languedoc itself. They had dealings with local lords, some of whom sheltered Cathar sympathisers. To raise their swords blindly for Rome risked alienating the very nobility whose trust and lands funded their survival. To remain neutral risked papal suspicion. Chroniclers suggest they tried to walk a middle path, offering protection to their own holdings while avoiding the worst excesses of the Crusade. Still, the flames reached them. The deeper issue was one of authority. The Vatican declared heresy and demanded extermination. But in practice, it was local knights and papal legates who carried out the slaughter, while the Templars, with their disciplined ranks and fortified houses, represented an alternative model of enforcement. Some whispered that they did not pursue heretics with enough zeal, that their silence in the face of Cathar beliefs revealed sympathy or at least hesitation. For a papacy that demanded absolute obedience, hesitation was nearly as damning as rebellion. As castles fell and Cathar strongholds like Montségur were reduced to ashes, the question of who defined orthodoxy grew sharper. Was it Rome with its decrees, or was it the sword that actually carried them out? The Vatican wanted the world to believe that faith was enforced by papal command, but everyone watching could see that the real power lay with those who held the battlefield. The Templars' careful restraint hinted at a power Rome could not fully direct. By the time the last Cathars were burned alive in 1244, the land had been scorched, its culture shattered, and its wealth absorbed by northern lords loyal to the Pope. Yet beneath the ashes smouldered a warning. The Templars had shown that they could not be wielded like a simple weapon. Their choices revealed an independence that frightened Rome. Fire had cleansed the Cathars, but it also illuminated the widening rift between the Vatican's authority and the knights who had once been its most loyal sword. The 13th century was an age of paper crowns as much as golden ones. In Rome, popes discovered that a stroke of the pen could be as binding as chains, and no group felt this more than the Knights Templar. To the outside world, the relationship looked like one of pure blessing. Papal bulls showered the order with privileges. They were freed from paying tithes to local bishops. They could build their own chapels. They could cross borders without interference. In effect, they answered only to the Pope himself. It sounded like divine favour. But inside those same documents were the seeds of control. Each privilege came wrapped in conditions, each freedom tied to obligations that gave Rome quiet leverage over its warrior monks. One bull might allow them to collect their own donations, but another required them to send yearly reports of their finances directly to the papal curia. One decree exempted them from the authority of local lords, but another demanded that their Grand Master pledge absolute obedience to the Pope. This was the uneasy dance of power. The Vatican needed the Templars' strength in the Holy Land and their wealth in Europe, but it also feared their independence. So parchment became a weapon, granting just enough rope for freedom while keeping a tighter cord hidden beneath. The Templars were no fools. They accepted the blessings, used them to expand their reach, but quietly stockpiled leverage of their own. Every fortress they built, every coin they lent to kings, every relic they protected became part of a reserve of power that could be drawn upon if Rome pushed too far. Monarchs knew that papal decrees carried weight, but they also knew that without Templar protection crusades faltered, pilgrim roads grew dangerous and treasuries dried up. The order made itself indispensable, and in that necessity lay its bargaining chip. Picture a council in the Lateran Palace. A pope dictates a bull, proclaiming the sacred authority of Rome over all knightly orders. At the same time, a scribe quietly reminds him that the Templars now control fortresses in Syria, Spain, and Cyprus, and that their bankers hold the debts of half the kings of Christendom. The bull is written, sealed, and proclaimed, but its force depends on the order's willingness to accept it. Rome had the appearance of control, the knights had the substance of it. This tension never fully broke into open conflict, but it was a constant undercurrent. Every new papal blessing came with a shadow of unease. The more power Rome granted, the more it feared what it had unleashed. And the more privileges the Templars received, the more they learned to guard their independence with quiet defiance. The world saw bulls sealed with red wax as signs of unity. In truth, they were fragile contracts, binding two powers that trusted each other only enough to survive. A pope's blessing was never just a gift. It was a leash, and the knights wore it only because they knew they could slip it loose when the moment came. In the glittering halls of Paris, beneath the vaulted ceilings of the Capetian court, the crown of France found itself bound not by chains, but by numbers. Wars were costly, crusades even more so, and the kings of France discovered that the safest vaults and surest lenders were not in their treasuries, but in the houses of the Knights Templar. The order had built a financial network stretching from London to Acre, capable of moving fortunes across continents with little more than coded letters and wax seals. For kings who bled silver as fast as they raised armies, the Templar ledgers became lifelines. But lifelines came with knots, and knots could strangle. Philip the Fair, sharp-minded and ambitious, learned this lesson bitterly at the dawn of the 14th century. His wars with England and Flanders drained the royal coffers until they lay nearly bare. The Templars stepped in with loans, vast sums that kept armies fed and castles manned. In return, they demanded not just interest but influence. Each transaction deepened the king's dependence. Each line in their books bound the monarchy tighter to the order's vaults. For a time it worked. The crown glittered, campaigns pressed forward, but beneath the surface, resentment grew. No king liked to kneel, and kneeling to monks with swords and sealed scrolls was humiliation. Philip began to see the order not as allies, but as rivals. Their wealth rivaled his own treasury, their fortresses stood as secure as royal castles. Their loyalty, though sworn to God, seemed to lean more toward their Grand Master than any crown. The debts mounted, repayment seemed impossible, and so the idea formed in the king's mind: if he could not free himself with coin, he would free himself with steel. The scheme took years to shape. Whispers crept through the court that the Templars were heretics, that they mocked the cross in secret rites, that they kissed each other in strange ceremonies and denied the sacraments. Some stories were wild, others carefully planted. Philip pressed the Vatican to investigate, framing his desperation as piety. If the order was condemned, their wealth could be seized. Their ledgers would vanish, the king's debts would dissolve into smoke. Rome hesitated, for it still needed the knights, but the steady pressure of royal ambition proved heavier than parchment seals. When dawn broke on Friday the 13th of October, in the year 1307, royal soldiers stormed Templar houses across France. Commanders were arrested, treasuries were seized. Charges of heresy, blasphemy, and corruption were hurled like spears. The spectacle was framed as righteous justice, but beneath it lay a simpler truth. A king had borrowed too much, and now he sought to balance his books with blood. The debt of a king was more than financial. It was the breaking point of an alliance that had shaped Christendom for nearly 2 centuries. The crown of France no longer bowed to Templar ledgers. Instead, it sought to erase them, and in doing so, it lit the fire that would consume the order itself. The morning of Friday the 13th, in October of the year 1307, dawned like any other. Yet by nightfall, it would be etched into memory as the day the Templars fell. Across France, in towns, castles, and commanderies, soldiers of King Philip moved with ruthless precision. Doors were smashed in, knights were dragged from their beds. Ledgers, relics, and sealed chests were seized. The operation was coordinated so tightly that the order, once famed for its discipline, had no chance to resist. What had taken nearly 2 centuries to build collapsed in a single day of fear. The charges were shocking, carefully crafted to stain not just the men, but the very idea of the Templars. Heresy, blasphemy, sorcery, secret rituals, even unnatural acts whispered in interrogations. Some knights confessed quickly under the weight of chains and the threat of torture. Others resisted until fire or rack forced their words. The spectacle was meant to do more than condemn. It was meant to erase the aura of sanctity that had surrounded the Red Cross for generations. No king could admit to simply robbing his bankers. He needed the cover of holy justice, and so the knights became villains in the eyes of the public. For the Vatican, the moment was a nightmare. The order had been Rome's own creation, blessed and privileged by papal bulls, tied directly to the authority of the Church. To defend them now risked siding with heretics and angering the most powerful monarch in Europe. To abandon them meant admitting that either the Church had been deceived for 2 centuries, or that it had blessed corruption all along. Neither path was clean. Pope Clement hesitated, caught between loyalty to the order and dependence on Philip. At first, he condemned the arrests, declaring them an overreach of royal power. But as more confessions poured in, many wrung from knights on the rack, the Vatican shifted, councils were called, debates raged. Was the order guilty or merely the victim of royal ambition? The truth mattered less than the survival of papal authority. Rome could not afford a scandal that suggested weakness, nor could it risk losing France's support in its endless struggle with other kingdoms. So, the Pope chose the middle road. He announced an inquiry, placing the order under church authority, yet quietly allowed Philip to continue his purge. The knights remained in chains, while the Vatican pretended to seek justice. In reality, the outcome had already been decided. The order was too tainted, too dangerous, and too wealthy to survive. Imagine the silence of a Templar chapel that day, its relics seized, its altars desecrated, its knights shackled in chains. For the men who had sworn oaths of poverty and obedience, the betrayal was complete. For the church that had once blessed them, the cost was unavoidable. Friday the 13th became more than a date. It became a symbol of how fear, ambition, and survival could conspire to destroy even the most sacred of legacies. The Vatican had made its choice. It chose survival, and the Templars paid the price. In the stone chambers of French prisons, the voices of the Knights Templar were broken not by choice, but by the crack of whips, the twist of ropes, and the slow grind of iron. Interrogators demanded confessions, and when silence held, they turned to fire and steel. Bound in chains, sleep-starved and battered, men who had once commanded armies whispered the words their captors wanted. They admitted to spitting on the cross, to denying Christ, to worshipping strange idols, to sins so vile they shocked the very scribes ordered to record them. But behind every confession lay the mark of pain. It was not truth being written down, it was survival. The notaries who copied the testimonies knew it. Some of them had grown up in the same towns as these knights. They could see the bruises, hear the slurred speech of men whose ribs had been cracked hours before. And though they were sworn to record what was said, some left subtle hints between the lines. A strange phrasing here, a doubtful word there, as if reminding any future reader that what looked like truth was forged in agony. One clerk noted that a knight confessed only after 3 days without food. Another scribbled that a prisoner recanted when the torture ended, only to repeat the confession when it began again. These were not open protests, but quiet fingerprints of conscience left on the margins of history. The official record swelled with accusations. Templars were said to worship a severed head, to kiss each other in places unholy, to perform dark rites at their initiations. The image painted was monstrous, designed to turn public opinion against the order forever. Yet in the gaps of those records, in the rare lines where a prisoner stood firm, a different story flickered. Some knights declared their innocence, even under torment, swearing that their only vows were to God, that their rituals were prayers, that the accusations were lies crafted by enemies. These voices were rare, drowned beneath the tide of forced confessions, but they endured like stubborn embers refusing to die. The Vatican's role in this theatre was complicated. Papal commissioners received the records, weighed them, and debated their meaning. Some must have known the truth, must have seen the pattern of pain written in every word. Yet, to admit, it would unravel the fragile balance between Rome and the French crown. So the Church leaned on the documents, pretending that the ink was untainted, that justice was being served. In truth, it was survival once again, not holiness, that guided the hand of judgment. Picture a knight chained in the dark, whispering words he does not believe just to see another sunrise. Imagine the scribe writing them down, leaving a small pause in his lettering, as if to say, I know. These fragments remind us that history is not only written by the victors, but by the weary hands of those forced to record lies. The confessions in chains were meant to destroy the order. Instead, they left behind shadows of doubt that even centuries of silence could not erase. In the late summer of the year 1308, while the public trials of the Knights Templar filled the streets of France with rumours of heresy, another meeting took place in secret. It happened in the castle of Chinon, far from the roar of mobs and the pressure of royal soldiers. Here, a handful of papal cardinals arrived under the authority of Pope Clement himself. Their task was not to condemn, but to listen, and what they heard complicated everything the world was being told. The Grand Master Jacques de Molay and several of the highest-ranking officers were brought before them. These men had already been paraded as villains in the courts of Philip the Fair. They had been tortured, humiliated, and forced into confessions that blackened their names. But in Chinon, the tone shifted. The papal envoys questioned them not as criminals but as brothers in Christ. Under oath and in private, the knights admitted that in some initiations, small symbolic acts had been performed that might appear strange to outsiders, gestures meant to test humility or obedience. but they swore again and again that they had never denied Christ, never abandoned their faith, never practiced the blasphemies laid upon them by royal accusation. They begged for forgiveness not as heretics, but as men caught in the storm of politics. The cardinals listened, and astonishingly, they granted absolution. In carefully written documents sealed with the authority of the Pope, they declared that the leaders of the order had been reconciled to the Church. They were forgiven. They were restored to communion. In the eyes of Rome, at least in that moment, they were not damned but cleansed. This act, later hidden in archives, created a second layer of truth. Publicly, the Templars were criminals. Privately, they had been pardoned. The contradiction revealed the depth of the Vatican's struggle. To defend the order openly risked war with France and the collapse of papal influence. To condemn them entirely risked silencing men who still carried secrets Rome was not ready to expose. Absolution behind closed doors was a compromise, a way to preserve the soul of the order while letting its body be sacrificed to politics. Imagine Jacques de Molay kneeling in that chamber, hearing words of forgiveness whispered by men who knew he could never share them with the world. Picture the cardinals dipping their pens into ink, drafting a record that would be sealed away, a document meant not to change history, but to preserve a sliver of conscience. The Chinon intervention was never meant for public eyes. It was a whisper in the dark, proof that even in betrayal, the Church hesitated to fully abandon its own creation. Centuries later, when the parchment was rediscovered, it shattered the image of unanimous guilt. It revealed that Rome had known the knights were not truly heretics, yet in the heat of survival it allowed the lie to stand. The Chinon absolution was both mercy and betrayal, a secret verdict hidden beneath the roar of fire and accusation. The year 1314 brought smoke to the skies of Paris, as Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, was tied to a stake and set ablaze. Crowds watched as the flames licked his body, and chroniclers say he cried out a curse against both Pope and King, summoning them to God's judgment within the year. Whether legend or truth, the deaths that followed soon after gave his words the weight of prophecy. For most it seemed the end of the order, its leaders executed, its properties seized, its honour buried under ashes. But endings in history are rarely clean, and for the Templars, death was only half the story. In the western port of La Rochelle, whispers tell of ships raising anchor on the very eve of the arrests. These vessels, loaded not only with knights but with chests of gold, relics, and perhaps even sacred documents, slipped quietly into the Atlantic. Their destination remains uncertain. Some claim they sailed to Portugal, where the order would soon re-emerge under the name of the Knights of Christ. Others imagine they crossed to Scotland, seeking refuge among clans hostile to the papacy. Still, others insist they vanished into the mist, carrying secrets that have never resurfaced. The image of white sails disappearing beyond the horizon lingers as a haunting symbol that the order's story was not entirely consumed by fire. Meanwhile, across Europe, smaller groups of knights melted into new lives. Some were absorbed into other monastic orders, trading their red crosses for different habits. Some entered local militias or noble households, their skills too valuable to waste. Others quietly continued their rituals in hidden priories, changing names but not practices, passing down symbols in carvings, in architecture, in silence. The network that had once stretched from Jerusalem to London did not vanish overnight. It fractured, it scattered, it adapted. The Vatican and the French crown believed they had destroyed a rival, but what they truly accomplished was to drive it underground. Ports where Templar ships had once docked remained active. Inns along pilgrim routes still bore traces of their symbols, and in places where records grew thin, legends began to fill the gaps. Tales of treasure buried beneath chapels, of knights living under assumed names, of relics spirited away to lands beyond papal reach, became part of folklore. Picture the ashes of de Molay drifting into the Seine, carried downriver as a crowd dispersed, believing they had witnessed an ending. Now picture far to the west, the creak of timbers and the snap of canvas as a ship cut through black water under starlight, carrying men who refused to surrender their vows to fire or decree. History recorded the ashes, but in hidden ports and whispered stories, the embers of the order still glowed. From those embers, new fires could be lit, and for centuries people would wonder whether the Templars had truly died, or whether they had simply learned to live in shadows. When the flames of Paris dimmed and the Templars were declared dead, Portugal quietly prepared a different ending. King Denis of Portugal, shrewd and pragmatic, recognized that the order's skills were too valuable to discard. His kingdom sat at the edge of Europe, facing the vast Atlantic, a frontier where ships mattered more than crowns. The knights who survived the purge in France found in Portugal a protector willing to bend the rules. And so, in the year 1319, with papal approval carefully negotiated, the Order of Christ was born. Officially, it was a new brotherhood, distinct from the disgraced Templars. Unofficially, it was the same men, with new habits and a different name. The Order of Christ inherited not just castles and lands, but a spirit of exploration. Freed from the suspicion of France and the burning eyes of Rome, they turned their gaze to the sea. Ports along Portugal's rugged coast became their new strongholds. Maps gathered from years of Templar travel were unrolled on tables in Lisbon and Porto. Pilgrim routes transformed into sea routes. The mysteries once tied to the Temple Mount now whispered across the waves of the Atlantic. What had been a crusade in stone became a crusade in water. The Order's new role expanded as Portugal's ambitions grew. By the 15th century, Prince Henry the Navigator used their resources to launch voyages down the coast of Africa, opening routes that would change the world. Caravels sailed under the Red Cross of the Order of Christ, a symbol strikingly similar to the one the Templars had once carried into battle. For sailors and explorers, it was more than a flag. It was a quiet inheritance, a reminder that their journeys were tied to secrets older than their king. Rome's influence over this transformation was minimal. The papacy had blessed the creation of the Order of Christ, but could not control how it was used. The wealth and maps once locked in Templar treasuries now fueled a maritime empire that placed Portugal at the forefront of discovery. Every voyage beyond the horizon carried with it the echo of the old order, as if the Templars had simply traded horses for ships and lances for sails. Whispers persisted that the knights carried more than ambitions of trade and conquest. Some claimed their fleets searched not just for spices and gold, but for hidden lands where relics might be stored or forgotten bloodlines preserved. The Atlantic, vast and unknown, offered space for legends as well as commerce. And in coastal chapels built by the Order, symbols carved into stone hinted at a memory that would not die. Spirals, bees, and cryptic crosses etched where only the faithful might notice. Imagine a harbour at sunset, sails marked with crimson crosses drifting toward the horizon while townspeople watch in silence. To them, it was Portugal's glory. To the initiated, it was something more, the survival of a brotherhood once burned in France but now reborn on the sea. The Order of Christ wore new habits, but beneath the cloth, the old vows endured, carrying their mysteries far beyond Rome's reach. In the cold winds of the Scottish lowlands, legends tell of ships that slipped away from La Rochelle and found shelter far from the reach of both Pope and King. Scotland, in the early 14th century, was a land in turmoil, locked in battles for independence against England. For exiled Templars, it was also a land of opportunity, a place where Rome's authority was weaker, and where alliances could be forged with clans and nobles desperate for skilled fighters. Here, far from Paris and Avignon, the Order's remnants are said to have nurtured a new kind of survival, not through armies or fortresses, but through stone and symbol. The most enduring trace of their presence is tied to Rennes-le Chapel, built in the 15th century by the Sinclair family. To the world, it is a masterpiece of Gothic craft, its pillars and arches carved with dazzling detail, but to those who look closer, it is more than a church. It is a book written in stone, a coded memory of rituals and knowledge too dangerous to preserve in words. Spirals and stars wind across its walls. Carvings of plants not yet known in Europe, including maize from the Americas, appear decades before Columbus sailed west. Columns bear patterns that align with sacred geometry, echoing designs from the Temple of Solomon. In these carvings, many see the fingerprints of Templar memory, preserved under the guise of artistry. Scotland's nobles offered more than sanctuary, they offered patronage. Families like the Sinclairs, long associated with the craft of builders and with whispers of secret guardianship, became sponsors of the Silent Brotherhood. In return, the Order's scattered knights offered skills in warfare, finance, and diplomacy. The relationship was not one of open banners and public vows, but of quiet exchange, a pipeline of protection and secrecy that flowed through stone chapels and noble halls. Over time, this alliance gave rise to rituals passed down in hushed ceremonies, rituals that would later find echoes in the lodges of Freemasonry. The Vatican never had full reach here. Scotland's distance and its constant wars made it a poor target for papal enforcement. That gap gave the exiled Templars breathing room. They could gather, remember, and adapt. Geometry became their language, architecture their scripture. Instead of parading relics, they carved meaning into capitals and stained glass, creating spaces where symbol preserved what words could not. A chapel could hold memory longer than any archive, and Rosslyn became the most famous of these silent sanctuaries. Imagine stepping into that chapel as light filters through narrow windows, illuminating carvings of angels beside cubes marked with numbers, vines twisting into knots that never end, a dance of stone that feels less like decoration and more like instruction. Here, the old order did not die. It transformed, clothed in artistry, and guarded by families who understood that some legacies were too dangerous to speak aloud. In Scotland, the Templars found not just a refuge, but a canvas. And in the silent chapel of Rosslyn, their memory still whispers, etched forever into the stone. The fall of the Templars in France was not the end of their persecution. It was only the beginning of a wider net cast by the Inquisition, whose reach stretched like a shadow from Avignon across the courts of Iberia and beyond. What began as a royal purge soon became a church-wide hunt, not just for men but for ideas. Doctrines were the true quarry, whispered teachings that had survived in hidden priories or been carried across borders in sealed chests. The Inquisition understood that heresy was not destroyed with fire alone. It lingered in books, in rituals, in memory, and so tribunals were unleashed to smoke it out. In Avignon, where the papacy had taken refuge, trial records piled high. Clerks copied confession after confession, layering accusations with questions that were repeated from town to town. Did the knights worship a head? Did they deny Christ? Did they kiss in secret places? The answers varied, but the rhythm of interrogation was the same, designed less to uncover truth than to create consistency, a web of guilt woven from repetition. What was spoken under torture in Paris now echoed in Toledo, Aragon, and Valencia, as if the script had already been written. Yet beneath the spectacle of justice, another story stirred. Certain parchments recovered during raids did not make their way into public trials. Instead, they vanished into locked chambers, taken by bishops or inquisitors who understood their value. Some were rumoured to be maps, others fragments of texts that hinted at alternative gospels. Still others, coded letters passed between knights across Europe. These were too dangerous to destroy outright, for even in suppression the Church had a habit of preserving what it condemned. The safest way to silence a document was not always to burn it, but to lock it away where only a few eyes might see. The Inquisition's long arm reached into Iberia with particular force. Spain and Portugal were already battlefields between Christians and Muslims, places where borders shifted and cultures mixed. In this environment, the remnants of Templar networks could easily blend into local orders. slipping beneath the notice of kings while preserving fragments of their lore. The tribunals pursued them relentlessly, but the very chaos of Iberia offered cover. Some knights were absorbed into the Order of Calatrava or Santiago, others folded into the newly formed Order of Christ. Their names changed, but their memories lingered, scattered like sparks too small to extinguish. Imagine the dim light of an inquisitor's chamber, a single parchment spread across the table, its margins filled with cryptic symbols. A decision must be made. To burn it is to erase it, but to preserve it is to risk discovery later. The choice is silence, a locked room, an archive marked private. These small decisions built a secret history alongside the public one, a history of vanished documents and hidden testimonies that would surface centuries later to challenge the neatness of official accounts. The Inquisition's long arm reached far, but even it could not erase everything. Some truths slipped through its fingers, preserved in silence until the world was ready to ask again. When the Templars fell, one question lingered louder than any charge of heresy. What exactly was the treasure they had guarded so fiercely? Was it a relic, a bloodline, or something as simple yet as powerful as financial knowledge? The theories diverge like rivers, but each path leads to the same unsettling truth. Whatever it was, Rome feared it enough to risk scandal, secrecy, and blood. The most famous claim is that the knights discovered the Holy Grail, not a jeweled cup, but a vessel of power that reshaped the meaning of divine authority. Some said it was the chalice of the Last Supper. Others claimed it was not an object at all, but a bloodline, the living descendants of Christ and Mary Magdalene. If the Templars had proof of such a lineage, it would strike at the very foundation of the papacy. For centuries, Rome had built its claim on apostolic succession, the idea that authority flowed from Peter to every pope. But if there existed a family that carried divine inheritance in their blood, the authority of Rome would shrink to parchment compared to living flesh. This possibility alone was enough to terrify the Vatican into silence. A second theory suggests that the Templars guarded relics far older than Christianity itself. During their long years beneath the Temple Mount, they may have uncovered artifacts tied to Jewish history, perhaps even remnants of the Ark of the Covenant. To control such relics would be to command symbols that could unite or divide faiths across continents. The papacy, already stretched thin by crusades and heresies, could not allow knights with independent loyalty to wield relics more powerful than its own shrines. The third possibility is less romantic, but no less threatening. The Templars created one of the first international banking systems. They mastered the art of moving wealth safely across borders through coded letters of credit. They lent to kings, financed crusades, and built a network of economic power that outpaced anything the papal treasury could match. If their records, their ledgers, and their methods survived, they represented not just riches, but knowledge of an entirely new kind of empire, one based not on land or relics, but on control of finance. To Rome, which thrived on donations and indulgences, this kind of shadow economy was dangerous. It made the church's coins feel small. Each theory explains why the order was feared. If the treasure was blood, it undermined theology. If it was relics, it threatened Rome's monopoly on holiness. If it was economic knowledge, it destabilized the very system on which kings and popes relied. And, perhaps the greatest fear of all, was that it was not just one of these, but all three woven together. Imagine a network that held sacred bloodlines, relics of awe, and the keys to wealth across Europe. No crown or tiara could ever truly command it. The treasure of the Templars may never be proven, but the panic with which their downfall was staged speaks volumes. Rome did not burn them only for heresy. It burned them for what they might have carried, and for what secrets might still remain hidden, untouched, and waiting. The Renaissance is remembered as a rebirth of art and reason, but beneath its painted ceilings and marble halls ran currents of older disputes. The quarrel between Rome and the memory of the Templars did not vanish in smoke. It shifted into subtler forms, encoded in paintings, hidden in palaces, whispered in patronage. As humanists celebrated the dignity of man and bankers financed visions of grandeur, they also carried forward fragments of the old struggle between centralized church power and ideas too dangerous to silence. In Florence, the Medici bankrolled artists who filled chapels with biblical scenes that seemed obedient on the surface, yet carried strange anomalies when studied closely. In Leonardo's Last Supper, the absence of a chalice puzzled many, while the figure beside Christ stirred whispers of Magdalene. Was it a mistake, or was it a quiet reminder of stories Rome had tried to bury? Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling under papal commission, yet slipped in figures of pagan sibyls and a god who looked less like a distant sovereign and more like a human father reaching toward man. These images acted as mirrors, reflecting back older quarrels over authority, blood, and divine closeness. Bankers, many of whom inherited or admired the Templar model of financial independence, built palaces that doubled as fortresses. Their architecture carried echoes of geometry once tied to knightly orders. Ratios of sacred proportion appeared not only in churches, but in merchant villas. To visitors, they were signs of sophistication. To initiates, they were reminders that certain truths could survive in mathematics and design when words were forbidden. A column carved with spirals or a floor laid in a perfect vesica pattern spoke in a language Rome could not censor. Humanists, too, challenged the monopoly of interpretation. They returned to ancient texts, studying Greek and Hebrew scriptures beyond the Vulgate authorized by the Vatican. Some whispered of lost gospels, of writings hidden in archives the Church would never release. In universities from Padua to Paris, the freedom to question grew. The line between inquiry and heresy thinned, but the Renaissance spirit protected it under the cloak of scholarship. Ideas once tied to knights and heretics found new life in the libraries of scholars and in the margins of their manuscripts. Rome tried to police this flood of expression, but the arts moved faster than decrees. A papal bull could condemn a book, but a fresco already painted could not be erased without scandal. A sculpture, once unveiled, stood in marble defiance, and patrons too wealthy to offend shielded their artists with gold and influence. The quarrel that had once been fought with fire and chains now played out in symbols too subtle to burn. Picture a visitor standing in a Florentine chapel, admiring a fresco of saints, never noticing the hidden star carved into a border or the strange tilt of a chalice painted in shadow. For the ordinary eye, it was beauty. For the careful observer, it was a mirror of an older struggle. The Renaissance did not kill the memory of the Templars. It refracted it into art, turning rebellion into beauty, and keeping alive questions that Rome could never fully silence. In the 16th century, as the Protestant Reformation tore through Europe and the memory of old heresies still haunted the Vatican, the Church found itself in desperate need of a new weapon. Out of this crisis rose the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, founded in the year 1540 by Ignatius of Loyola. Unlike the Templars, they carried no swords into battle. Their war was one of minds, words, and missions. Where the Templars had been accused of secrecy and dangerous knowledge, the Jesuits positioned themselves as guardians of truth, scholars trained to defend the faith with reason as well as devotion. Yet in their rise, one can see the echo of an earlier struggle, a countermove designed to regain narrative control that had slipped during centuries of whispers about knights and their forbidden law. The Jesuits became masters of education. Universities across Europe fell under their direction. In their classrooms, history, theology, and science were all reframed under the lens of Catholic orthodoxy. Where the Templars had allowed rumours of alternative texts to circulate, the Jesuits ensured that only approved versions reached the next generation. Libraries were stocked with volumes carefully vetted. Scholars who strayed too far into speculation were corrected or silenced. It was not only about spreading knowledge, but about consolidating which knowledge survived. The Vatican had learned from its past mistake. It would never again allow an independent brotherhood to shape doctrine outside its reach. At the same time, the Jesuits became missionaries, carrying the papal message to lands far beyond Europe. In Asia, in Africa, in the Americas, they planted schools and churches that linked Rome's authority to distant peoples. Where the Templars had once dreamed of global networks through ports and pilgrim routes, the Jesuits achieved something greater, a web of souls tied not by coin or relic, but by education and conversion. For the Vatican, this was the ultimate countermove. Every chapel built in Japan, every college raised in Brazil, was a reminder that the Pope's reach still extended, that Christendom was not shrinking but expanding under careful watch. Yet, perhaps their most enduring role was in the archives. The Jesuits became keepers of memory, gathering manuscripts, collecting documents, and centralizing them in Rome. If the Templars had once hidden gospels and relics in castles and chapels, the Jesuits now ensured that any dangerous text was locked away in the Vatican library. They became the curators of history, deciding what would be preserved, what would be restricted, and what would be forgotten. Scholars came to study, but only through lenses the Church controlled. Imagine a student in the 17th century walking into a Jesuit college, eager to learn the mysteries of the world. His teachers speak of Aristotle and Augustine, of Christ and the saints, guiding him carefully within safe boundaries. He never knows what lies beyond the shelves, never sees the locked rooms where forbidden texts rest. The Jesuits had perfected what Rome had always desired, a brotherhood as disciplined as the Templars, but one whose loyalty was absolute and whose weapons were knowledge itself. In this way, the Vatican reclaimed the power of narrative, ensuring that the story of faith was written in ink it alone could authorize. When Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself emperor in the year 1804, the world saw more than a soldier seizing a throne. They saw a master of symbols staging theatre to outshine both monarchy and church. Among the banners, robes, and insignia that filled his coronation was one image that puzzled many, the golden bee. To the Bourbon dynasty that had ruled before him, the symbol was strange and unsettling. To the Vatican, it was even more disturbing, because the bee carried echoes of something older, something tied to forgotten empires, and the secret traditions whispered about the Templars. Napoleon was a strategist, not only on the battlefield, but in the realm of myth. The Bourbons had built their legitimacy on the fleur-de-lis, a symbol blessed by centuries of papal approval. By rejecting it and reviving the bee, Napoleon drew from Merovingian law, the dynasty of kings who had ruled France more than 1,000 years earlier. According to legend, these kings were connected to sacred bloodlines, a claim that had often been linked, however loosely, to Templar myths of hidden heirs and divine inheritance. By stitching bees into his imperial cloak, Napoleon presented himself not as the successor of Bourbon kings, but as the restorer of an even older and more mysterious order. The Vatican, still struggling to reassert authority after the upheaval of the French Revolution, saw in Napoleon's spectacle a dangerous echo. Here was a ruler bypassing papal blessing, choosing his own symbols, and invoking sacred legitimacy outside the authority of Rome. It reminded them too much of the knights who had once claimed direct allegiance to Christ rather than to the Pope. Bees swarmed not only on his robes, but across coins, seals, and architecture, embedding themselves into the fabric of his empire. Each one was a subtle defiance of the Vatican's monopoly on sacred imagery. The spectacle did not stop there. Napoleon staged rituals that borrowed from medieval orders, invoking chivalry while reshaping it into imperial loyalty. He surrounded himself with new knights and honours, drawing lines of continuity back to crusading traditions. The message was clear. Where others had depended on papal approval to wield sacred power, Napoleon would craft his own authority by reviving symbols that lay outside Rome's control. The Bourbon dynasty trembled at the erasure of their fleur-de-lis. The Vatican trembled at the resurrection of imagery that hinted at alternative bloodlines and ancient claims. Imagine the cathedral in Notre Dame filled with incense, choirs echoing, and yet the Pope, summoned all the way from Rome, forced to sit and watch as Napoleon placed the crown on his own head. The bees glittered under candlelight, quiet messengers of a story that bypassed both Bourbon legacy and papal decree. In that moment, Napoleon was not just emperor. He was a storyteller, rewriting history with cloth and gold. His empire would not last, but his symbols endured, unsettling those who recognized their deeper meaning. For Rome, it was a chilling reminder that the old quarrels had not died. They had simply been dressed in new robes, their sting as sharp as ever. In the late 19th century, the quiet French village of Rennes-le-Chateau became the stage for a mystery that pulled the shadow of the Templars back into modern memory. At the centre of it all was Berenguer Saunière, a simple parish priest with a modest post in the hills of the Razès. By all accounts, he should have lived in poverty, serving a flock too small and too poor to bring him wealth. Yet suddenly, without clear explanation, Saunière began renovations that transformed his crumbling church into a spectacle of coded decor. Statues, inscriptions, and murals appeared that seemed to whisper secrets in stone, and with them came rumours that revived old wounds between Rome and the memory of the warrior monks. Money poured into the village, far more than a priest of his station could expect. Some claimed he had discovered hidden documents while repairing the altar, parchments that tied back to the days of the Templars, or perhaps to something even older. Others whispered that wealthy patrons secretly funneled funds to him in exchange for silence. His sudden fortune unsettled the locals and drew the eyes of the church. Where had this money come from, and why was it cloaked in secrecy? The Vatican launched inquiries, but the priest played his role with skill, denying nothing, admitting nothing, and letting rumours do the work for him. The decor of his church fed the fire. Carvings and paintings depicted biblical scenes, but with odd details out of place. Demons leered where saints should stand. Phrases in Latin carried double meanings. The layout of the symbols seemed less like devotion and more like code. Visitors began to wonder if Saunière was leaving behind a trail, clues pointing toward a hidden treasure or a forbidden truth. Some connected it to the Templars' supposed flight from La Rochelle, imagining that the treasure of the order had been hidden in the Razès, buried beneath hills that had once sheltered Cathars and Crusaders. Others believed it was tied to bloodline legends, claiming that parchments revealed secret heirs whose existence Rome had long tried to erase. The more the priest built, the stranger the theories became. Was he protecting relics? Was he mocking the Vatican by embedding secret knowledge into sacred walls? Or was he simply enjoying the thrill of mystery, playing a game that would echo louder than his sermons ever could? Whatever the truth, the story spread. Writers and seekers from across Europe visited the small village, each convinced they stood on the edge of revelation. Rennes-le-Chateau became less a parish and more a portal, a place where medieval secrets reached into the modern age. Imagine walking into that tiny church, the smell of incense heavy in the air, your eyes drawn to an inscription that seems just slightly wrong, a phrase that hints at something hidden beneath your feet. Outside, the hills roll quiet and green, but inside, every detail feels deliberate, as if Saunière knew that one day strangers would come searching. The priest of the Razès left no clear answers, only a legacy of rumour. Yet, in those rumours, the old war was revived, pulling the Templars and the Vatican back into debate centuries after the flames had died. In the first half of the 20th century, the old quarrel between Templar memory and Vatican authority was dragged into the chaos of modern war. As empires fell and republics rose, the Vatican found itself playing a dangerous game of diplomacy, striking concordats with states that promised protection while quietly shielding its archives from prying eyes. In Germany, Italy, and beyond, rulers understood that controlling symbols mattered as much as controlling armies. The Vatican signed agreements that secured its independence, yet each bargain carried shadows, as governments sought to draw on sacred legitimacy to fuel their power. At the same time, occultists and ideologues rummaged through history like treasure hunters, armed with flags and guns. Secret societies in Europe reawakened interest in the Templars, casting them as mystical ancestors or guardians of forbidden knowledge. In Germany, fringe scholars twisted medieval legends into tools for propaganda, claiming that ancient orders had held secrets of race, blood, and destiny. What had once been whispered in cloisters now became material for rallies, banners, and state-funded expeditions. The Vatican watched uneasily as myths it once sought to bury were wielded as weapons by men who cared nothing for theology. Libraries were raided, monasteries searched, and private collections stripped of manuscripts. Some of the files taken were mundane, but others hinted at vanished records that pointed back to suppressed texts or secret lineages. Rumours spread of hidden vaults under castles and churches where relics had been stashed centuries earlier, treasures not of gold but of authority. Whoever held them could claim legitimacy, and in a time of total war, legitimacy was a weapon as sharp as any blade. The Vatican's archives became both shield and target, a place whose silence was louder than any sermon. Across Europe, soldiers marched while in quiet offices. Agents traced symbols and codes drawn from the medieval past. The image of the Templars appeared in pamphlets, art, and even in the rituals of new movements that borrowed freely from the legends. It was as if the order that had been burned in the 14th century had returned as a ghost, summoned not by faith, but by ambition. For the Vatican, this was deeply unsettling. For every echo of the Templars stirred questions of authority it preferred forgotten. As bombs fell on Rome and cities crumbled, concordats became lifelines. The Vatican negotiated fiercely to maintain sovereignty, to keep its walls standing and its secrets intact. Yet, even in this survival, it faced a new kind of rival. No longer knights with swords, but regimes armed with myths sharpened into ideology. And beneath it all, the same questions lingered that had haunted Europe since the fall of the Order. What truth had the Templars carried, and why did so many across centuries try to claim it? When the smoke cleared after the wars, states had shifted, empires were gone, and the Vatican still stood. But the legends had spread too far, woven into the fabric of modern imagination, waiting for the next hand to pick them up and turn them once more into power. Picture a long corridor deep beneath Rome, the kind that smells of dust and iron, where fluorescent light hums against stone that has held silence for centuries. Here, the Vatican's secret archives stretch like a labyrinth, rows upon rows of shelves stacked with boxes, scrolls, and volumes whose covers have not been touched in generations. For most of history, the barrier to these secrets was a locked door, a guard, or the word no. Today, the barrier is stranger, written in code and algorithm, in redacted indices and digital scans that reveal just enough to remind the world of what still lies hidden. The modern age has not ended the old war. It has only given it a new battlefield. Researchers, armed with laptops and scanners, push against the wall of secrecy, hoping to glimpse what really happened in the years of the Templars and the centuries that followed. Some files have been released, carefully selected, offering fragments of truth, but never the whole picture. The Chinon parchment, uncovered in 2001, shocked scholars by revealing that the papacy had once absolved the Templars even as their order was being destroyed. If that truth could be hidden for 700 years, what else lies beneath the quiet of the shelves? For every document opened, another appears in the catalogue with its description blacked out, a reminder that silence remains the strongest weapon of all. Meanwhile, the digital world creates a new kind of tension. Algorithms, designed to track keywords in scanned texts, occasionally stumble on strange phrases, references to relics, bloodlines, and secret rites. A researcher might find the words but not the page, a title but not the text. It is like staring through frosted glass, seeing a shadow of what might be, and knowing that someone decided you could only glimpse it but never touch it. This partial vision has become the modern version of rumour, fueling debates across forums, books, and conferences. Once again, the story of the Templars bleeds into the 21st century, carried not by parchment, but by pixels. Governments too understand the stakes. Agreements are still made, concordates of a digital kind, granting limited access under strict control. Corporations handling digitization are bound by contracts, and with every scan comes a question of ownership. Who holds the key to memory in an age where archives can be copied and shared in seconds? And more importantly, who decides what should remain hidden? The Vatican insists it guards not secrets, but sanctity, protecting faith from confusion. Yet, for those who remember the burning of knights and the vanishing of names, that explanation feels familiar, perhaps too familiar. So, we return to the final room, not a chamber of stone, but a server vault, humming with the quiet of machines that carry centuries of memory. Somewhere in that data are stories that could shift how the world sees power, faith, and truth. Perhaps the treasure was never gold or relics, but control over memory itself. The war that began with swords and bulls now plays out in archives and algorithms, and the question that haunted kings and popes still whispers today: who owns the keys?